That, my friends, is a West Coast IPA that I brewed for the Free Hills home brewing competition. It's got Ahtanum Cryo hops in it, it's got Simcoe, it's got Citra. It was brewed with Vermont yeast, and I think it's turned out pretty well. So this video is going to be a grain to glass. I'll go through the brewing process and recipe for this, and obviously a little bit of a tasting at the end. And if I'm lucky, I might be able to get the feedback and results from the actual competition itself as well, because it's actually being judged this weekend. So fingers crossed for that. And yeah, whether it does well in the competition or not, hopefully you'll enjoy the video. Cheers. Right, let me talk to you a little bit about Free Hills Brewing first of all. They are a local, fairly local brewery to me. They're quite new and definitely one of the up and coming names in the UK craft beer scene. They make some fantastic beers. I've been lucky enough to sample a lot of them because they are regularly stocked by the bottle shop that's local to me. And they've always been quite supportive of the sort of local home brewing scene as well. They've actually been involved with the Bedford Home Brewing Club, helping us to run a competition. They came down and judged that a while ago, and one of our brewers got to go and make a beer with them as a result of that. That was then served at a festival in Bedford that was run by the beer shop that hosts our meetings. So really good guys, really good beers. If you get a chance to, I would recommend you try them. And they've recently started off a home brewing club on Facebook. So if you fancy, go and check that out as well. To start that off, they basically launched this competition. Remember competitions? Yeah, there's not been many of those around for a little while, but they essentially said first 50 people to sign up will get sent 200 grams of Ahtanum Cryo hops. So, you know, really decent thing to get you started off with the beer making there, and basically brew any style of beer you want with those hops, send it back in, and then we'll judge them. So an open kind of competition in terms of style, and basically best beer wins sort of thing. So I think they ended up getting pretty much all of the beers back. It was 44 entries, I think they said on their Instagram post that they judged yesterday. And yeah, it must have been good fun going for all of those. So hopefully they survived the process. And I look forward to hopefully them doing a few more competitions as well. And once the local home brewing groups are all up and running properly, maybe getting those involved as well, and having some face-to-face meetings again. So let's talk about the beer that I made for the competition. When I saw that it was Ahtanum Cryo hops, I kind of knew that I was going to do a West Coast IPA, because they're definitely a sort of old school West Coast style hop, and I just fancied making a West Coast IPA because I'm on a bit of a West Coast phase at the moment. I think there's so many, you know, kind of hazy NEPA style beers around at the moment that when you get a really nice crisp IPA with a bit of punchy bitterness and that nice resiny kind of hop flavour, it can kind of, well, for me at least, sort of remind you of what some of the beer styles that have got a lot of us into drinking, you know, craft beer in the first place, I think. And I just really enjoy them. So this is what I came up with. I'll just run through the recipe quickly for you. So we had 5.7 kilos of Pilsner malt to start with, or lager malt. I do like to use kind of lager malt as a base for IPAs because it just gives you a real nice clean slate. For the beer, then I put in 680 grams of Simpson's Munich malt, 260 grams of Cara malt, some crystal rye malt as well, 160 grams of that, and then some light crystal, 150 grams of that. That's about 90 EBC, the stuff that I was using. So there's a fairly decent whack of crystal malts in there. It's about 8% in total. Normally with West Coast IPAs, I do tend to steer on the lower end of the crystal malts, and certainly lighter in colour, because I tend to like a fairly light coloured beer, but also not too much the caramel flavour. But recently I've tried a few American IPAs that have had more of that caramel, and I really enjoyed them. So I thought on this one I'd go with a little bit more caramel malt. I also put a little bit of the rye in there just because I thought, why not? I like a little bit of rye. There's not really enough in there to give you a distinct rye flavour, but I think when you use crystal rye, you can get some of that crystal flavour without it being too kind of cloyingly sweet. It's yeah, difficult to describe really, but it doesn't seem to be quite as powerful a flavour as you might get from the equivalent colour of normal caramel malt. So that was for a 23 litre batch, by the way. I make beers like this at a slightly larger batch size usually to make up for the losses through the dry hopping and just the sheer amount of hops that are going in during the boil as well. And that tends to help just have a few extra litres there that you can afford to lose at the end when you're putting it into a keg. Then on to the hopping. I didn't actually mention the Columbus that I put into this. So it's got Simcoe, Citra, Ahtanum, and there's also some Columbus in there as well. I'm really liking putting in a bit of the those sort of classic C hops like Columbus and Chinook into IPAs at the moment to give you a real bit of bite on the flavour and the bittering. So there was 20 grams of Columbus in at 60, 15 grams of the Ahtanum hops in at 10, 15 grams of Columbus in at 10, and then the rest of it was in the hop stand for the boil, or the whirlpool. So we had 35 grams each of Ahtanum, Citra and Simcoe, whirlpooled for 20 minutes at 80 degrees C. And the dry hop was 60 grams of the Ahtanum, 40 grams of the Citra and 40 grams of the Simcoe for a couple of days before I cold crashed and dropped that out. Bearing in mind the Ahtanum hops are cryo hops, a lot of people would say that you can effectively halve the quantities of those. So in terms of this recipe, you could kind of assume if you're using normal hops that you might want to use more of the Ahtanum or the equivalent to that. If you were going to try and do this recipe yourself, maybe double it up. I don't know. If you were going to try and do this recipe, it is going to be very hard for you to acquire Ahtanum cryo hops, so you might want to look for an alternative. Ahtanum always seems to be in quite short supply anyway, just the normal hops. Something to do with Brewdog using lots of it, I've heard, but I don't know whether that's the case or not. And cryo hops, you basically, as far as I know, you can't really buy those at a homebrew scale anyway. So if I was going to swap that out for something, I'd go for another hop with a kind of orangey citrus kind of flavour to it. I think Amarillo is used a lot as a substitute for Ahtanum, and maybe go for one of the enhanced sort of versions of that, so a kind of BBC hop or something like that, if you can get it. But there's lots of other, sort of maybe old school West Coast hops that you could sub in there for that instead. Maybe even something just like a Cascade or a Centennial or something like that, perhaps. Anyway, that's the base of the recipe. It is fermented with Vermont yeast, but in this case it's at the Sanders strain from, I've forgotten what they're called now. Is it WHC? Anyway, I'll put a link to the strain that I mean. They're available at quite a few of the UK homebrew suppliers now. As I mentioned before, this is a 23 litre batch. The target gravity was 1066. Final gravity was targeted at 1013. That would give us about a 7% beer. IBU's fairly high. It is a West Coast, so I did go for a Bugu ratio around about 1, which gave me about 66 IBUs targeted for the recipe. Colour about 18, so I mean you can see here fairly sort of amber colour to the beer, and yeah, that's about it. Mashed at 65 degrees to try and give me a fairly dry finish, although with this yeast I think it was always going to finish a little bit higher anyway, so good to have a quite low mash temperature. give this beer a go and see what we think. I did take it to the home brew club the other day, and it did get some nice feedback from people. And like I said, I really like it as well. So on the aroma, there's a particular beer review channel in the UK where the guy uses the term fleshy blood orange a lot to describe most of the beers that he's reviewing, to be honest, but or certainly the IPAs and pale ales and stuff like that. And I've never sort of thought, oh, that's I've distinctly got that from a beer, but the aroma on this does have a real sharp, orangey kind of smell to it that does actually make me think of a kind of freshly cut blood orange. There's also a good bit of sweetness from the caramel on the nose as well. And just kind of, that sort of bright citrus rind, classic kind of American IPA aroma to it. It smells really good, I've got to say. The head on it is still sticking around. It has dropped down a little bit, and the colour, it's not completely hazy. There's a little bit of haze to it. But you can see at the bottom of the glass, it is kind of clearing up a little bit, and there's a decent level of carbonation in there. You can see a few bubbles streaming up from the bottom. So let's give it a taster. Now, as with any West Coast IPA, there is a good hit of bitterness up front with this beer, which I like, but there's sweetness there as well. So you do get the caramel too. So there's kind of a bitter sweet, orange caramel thing going on straight away. And then there's a like resiny, piney kind of flavor that comes in at the end as well. And the bitterness kind of coats your mouth a little bit. It's got a decent amount of body to it. So because it's quite bitter, you do have a kind of fairly dry finish on it, but it's still quite full in terms of the body as well. So the caramel sweetness, I think, helps with that a lot. I think there's maybe some stone fruit stuff going on in there. I don't know whether that's from the hops. There certainly could be some of that from the kind of Citra and maybe the Simcoe as well. A little bit of perhaps just a hint of a herbal note there from maybe the Columbus too. But there might be some esters coming through from the yeast as well. I think Vermont yeast can give you some of that kind of peachy sort of stone fruit stuff going on as well. There's definitely a little bit of that in the background. Now, overall, it's just, to my palate anyway, I think it's a really nice balanced beer. It's got the kind of classic West Coast IPA flavors to it. And I would definitely revisit this recipe and brew this beer again for sure. I hope the guys at Three Hills enjoyed it, and we'll hopefully see how it did in the competition.
I'm the dude. So that's what you call me, that or his dudeness or duder or, El Duderino if you're not into the whole brevity thing.